The roar of the rushing rapids was the only sound Ethan Quinn could hear. He was perched on Ponderosa Ridge, tracking cattle, when a scream sliced through the air. A woman's scream. Down below, two men were dragging her to the edge of the churning Snake River. They didn't hesitate. They just shoved her into the violent current. Son of a bitch, Ethan muttered. He forgot the cattle. He forgot the last 2 days on the trail. In Wyoming Territory, 1876, you saw your fair share of cruelty. But this was different. This was cold. He spurred his horse, a powerful stallion, and thundered down the rocky slope. Dust and stones kicked up behind him as he tried to calculate where the river would take her. He had to be faster than the current. She was already being swept away. Her blue dress fanned out on the surface, a fleeting tragic flower on the brown water. The two men were already on their horses, riding hard in the other direction, disappearing into the pines. They thought their work was done. "Hold on!" Ethan shouted, the words lost in the river's roar. He didn't slow his horse. He dismounted at a full gallop, hitting the ground running. His gun belt fell to the dirt. Then his hat. Then his boots. He didn't have time to think, only to act. He hit the water, and the June cold was a shock that stole his breath. The current grabbed him instantly, a powerful hand trying to drag him under, to pull him down into the darkness. But Ethan was a strong swimmer. It was an odd skill for a cowboy, but he'd grown up near the Mississippi, and what was once a boyhood pastime was now the only thing standing between a stranger and her grave. He saw her just ahead, her head bobbing in and out of the water. She was being tossed between jagged rocks like a rag doll. The river didn't care. It just wanted to carry her away. A vicious surge slammed her against a huge boulder. Her body went limp for a terrifying second before she started struggling again, her fight for life a desperate, silent battle. Ethan pushed himself forward, using the current's own power against it, fighting to control his direction. His lungs were on fire. The distance between them was closing, but it felt like miles. He saw her go under. One moment she was there, a flash of blue and dark hair. The next, she was gone. He didn't hesitate. He dove down, the murky water stinging his eyes, his hands grasping at nothing. Then he felt it. Fabric. He pulled, and his hand found an arm. With every ounce of strength left in his legs, he kicked for the surface, breaking through with a desperate gasp for air. "I've got you," he sputtered, pulling her limp body close to his chest. Her face was ghost pale. A gash on her forehead was streaming blood, mixing with the river water on her cheek. Her eyes were closed. She wasn't fighting anymore. "Stay with me, miss." But the real fight was just beginning. He had her, but the river still had them both. Every time he made progress toward the bank, another set of rapids would grab them and drag them further downstream. His muscles screamed, his arms felt like lead. But he refused to let go. He saw a calmer eddy near an overhanging willow tree, a small pocket of peace in the chaos. It was their only chance. With a final surge of adrenaline, he angled them toward it. His bare feet touched the bottom, sharp rocks cutting into his soles. But he didn't feel it. He half dragged, half carried her onto the muddy bank. He collapsed beside her, his body trembling with exhaustion. He rolled her onto her side, watching, waiting, praying. Water trickled from her mouth. "Come on, breathe," he urged, his voice raspy. He remembered seeing a doctor do this once for a drowned boy. He turned her onto her back and pressed firmly on her chest. Once. Twice. For a few terrifying moments there was nothing, just the sound of the river and his own ragged breathing. And then she convulsed, a violent, racking cough that spewed water from her lungs. He quickly turned her onto her side again as she dragged in a shuddering breath. Her eyes fluttered open. They were startlingly blue, and they fixed on him with a dazed, unfocused confusion. "You're safe now," Ethan said, his voice softer than he intended. He pushed a wet strand of dark hair from her face. "I'm Ethan Quinn. Those men, they're gone. She tried to speak, but another fit of coughing seized her. When it finally passed, she whispered a single word. Juliana, her name. Juliana Harrington. Her eyes started to close again. Miss Harrington, he said, trying to keep her conscious. We need to get you somewhere warm. My camp's not far. Can you stand? She gave a weak nod, but when Ethan helped her to her feet, her knees buckled. She would have collapsed if he hadn't caught her. Without a second thought, he swept her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, and so incredibly cold. My horse should be nearby, he said, scanning the riverbank. He prayed the stallion hadn't bolted. And then he saw him, 50 yards downstream, grazing calmly on a patch of grass as if nothing had happened. A good horse was worth more than gold in this country. Carrying Juliana across the rocky terrain in his stocking feet was brutal, but leaving her alone was not an option. By the time they reached the horse, her body was shaking with violent, uncontrollable shivers. This was the real danger now. The cold could kill her just as surely as the river. We need to get you warmed up fast, he said, his voice tight with concern. He carefully lifted her onto the saddle, then mounted behind her, wrapping one arm securely around her waist. He could feel her trembling against his chest. Thank you, she managed to say through chattering teeth. You saved my life. Let's get you truly saved before you start thanking me, Ethan replied, spurring his horse away from the river and toward the faint trail that led to his camp. Those men might realize their job isn't finished, and they might just come back to make sure it is. The ride to his camp felt like an eternity. Juliana drifted in and out of consciousness, her head resting against his shoulder. When she was awake, he kept her talking, asking simple questions to keep her mind working. He learned she had come all the way from Boston. She was a teacher, hired to open a new school in a town called Jackson, a town he was heading towards himself. As his small hidden campsite came into view, she murmured something, her voice weak. Those men, they were sent by Vernon Sterling. The name hit Ethan like a physical blow. He knew it. Everyone in this part of Wyoming knew that name. Sterling was a wealthy rancher, a man who owned everything and everyone. He controlled the town council, the sheriff, everything. He doesn't want the school to open, she whispered, and then her eyes closed again. Ethan's jaw tightened. It all made a sick kind of sense now. A school meant education. An educated populace might start getting ideas. They might start questioning the man who kept them poor and dependent on his scraps of generosity. A schoolteacher from Boston was a threat to Vernon Sterling's little kingdom. Sterling will have to come through me to finish what he started, Ethan said, his voice a low growl. He dismounted and carefully lifted Juliana from the saddle. His camp was simple, a small canvas tent, a fire pit, and his saddlebags. He gently set her down on his bedroll inside the tent. Her wet dress was clinging to her, and she was still shivering. I need to get you out of these wet clothes, he said, trying to sound practical, not personal. I have a spare shirt and trousers. They'll be too big, but they'll be dry. He saw the vulnerability in her eyes and quickly added, I'll step outside while you change. She nodded gratefully, too exhausted to argue. Ethan went to work, building a fire with practiced speed, putting his coffee pot on to boil. He retrieved his spare clothes from his saddlebag, a worn flannel shirt and sturdy canvas trousers. He handed them into the tent without looking, then turned back to the fire, stoking the flames higher, willing the heat to fight back the cold that had settled deep into her bones. He waited, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant sounds of the wilderness. He was a man who preferred solitude, but tonight the silence felt heavy with threat. After a few minutes, she called out, her voice weak but clear. I'm decent. When Ethan entered the tent, he had to stop himself from smiling. She was swimming in his clothes. The flannel shirt hung to her knees, the sleeves rolled up half a dozen times. She'd used a piece of rope to cinch the trousers around her waist. The bruise on her cheek was darkening, and her hair was a tangled mess. But even now he could see she was beautiful. It was a thought that felt out of place, dangerous even, given the circumstances. "Let me take a look at that cut on your head," he said, his voice all business. He knelt beside her with a handkerchief he'd dampened with water from his canteen. He gently cleaned the wound on her forehead, relieved to see it wasn't as deep as he'd first feared. It had just bled a lot. She watched him, her blue eyes surprisingly steady. "Are you a doctor as well as a cowboy?" she asked, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time. "Just a cowboy who's had his share of injuries," he replied, his touch gentle. "This won't need stitching. We just need to keep it clean." He finished tending to the cut and then handed her a tin cup of hot black coffee. He watched her drink it, her hands still shaking slightly. He gave her some jerky, and she ate it slowly, the simple food seeming to bring a little life back into her. But the exhaustion was plain on her face. Her eyes grew heavy. "Rest," Ethan urged. "We're safe here for tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do about Sterling." She looked at him, her gaze searching his face in the flickering firelight. "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't even know me." Ethan stared into the small fire, considering the question. It was a good one. He had cattle to deliver. He had a life that was simple and uncomplicated. Getting involved with this woman and her powerful enemy was the opposite of simple. "Where I come from," he said finally, "you don't turn your back on someone in need. Simple as that." "There's nothing simple about jumping into rapids to save a stranger," Juliana countered softly. Her eyes didn't leave his face. He felt like she could see right through him, past the hardened cowboy exterior to the man he used to be. "Get some rest, Miss Harrington," he said, standing up. "We've got a long day ahead of us tomorrow." As Juliana drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep, Ethan sat at the entrance of the tent, his rifle across his knees. He stared out into the vast, dark Wyoming night. He wasn't just a cowboy trailing cattle anymore. He was now the protector of a woman who had a target on her back. Sterling's men would be out there. They'd be looking for her, and now they'd be looking for him too. He intended to be ready. He had pulled her from the river, but he knew deep down that the real danger was still to come. This was far from over. Dawn broke with the distant call of a whippoorwill. Ethan hadn't slept, not really. He dozed in short, fitful bursts, his senses on high alert for the snap of a twig or the whinny of a strange horse. He already had coffee brewing and was warming a can of beans over the fire when Juliana emerged from the tent. She looked surprisingly better. The color was back in her cheeks, and she'd managed to comb her fingers through her dark hair, taming it into a loose braid. She was still wearing his oversized clothes, which gave her a strangely vulnerable look that clashed with the determination in her eyes. "You look like you didn't sleep," she observed, accepting the tin cup of coffee he offered. "Sleep's overrated," Ethan replied with a wry smile. "How are you feeling?" "Alive, thanks to you." She touched the gash on her forehead gingerly. "And determined," Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Determined to do what, exactly?" "To open my school." Her blue eyes flashed with a fire that surprised him. "Mr. Sterling thinks he can intimidate me into leaving. He thinks he can just wash me down the river and solve his problem. But he has severely underestimated how stubborn a woman from Boston can be." Ethan couldn't help but admire her spirit, but it worried him too. This wasn't some intellectual debate in a Boston parlor. This was Wyoming, where problems were often solved with rope and iron. "Those men weren't trying to intimidate you, Miss Harrington," he said, his voice grave. "They were trying to kill you." "Please call me Juliana," she said, taking a sip of her coffee. Her gaze was steady. and I am well aware of what they were attempting to do. It only strengthens my resolve. If a school is that threatening to a man like him, then it's more important than I ever imagined." "Well, Juliana," Ethan said, shaking his head slightly, "I admire your courage. I truly do. But courage without a plan is just a fancy way to get yourself killed. We can't just let you walk back into Jackson. Sterling's men will be watching every road. They'll be waiting." She straightened her shoulders, a spark of defiance in her posture. "I didn't ask for your protection, Mr. Quinn." "It's Ethan," he corrected gently. "And no, you didn't. But it looks like you've got it all the same." Their eyes locked for a long moment, a silent battle of wills. He saw her pride, her fierce independence. She saw his stubborn refusal to back down. Finally, she let out a small sigh, breaking the tension. "What do you suggest, then, Ethan?" He felt a small victory. "I've got cattle to deliver to a ranch just south of Jackson. I was planning on being in town by tomorrow anyway. We'll wait, let things cool down a bit. Then we ride in together. I'll help you get settled, and we'll figure out how to deal with Sterling." "I have a small cabin near the schoolhouse," Juliana said. "Or at least, I'm supposed to. The town council arranged it. I've never actually seen it." "Then that's where we'll go," Ethan nodded. "But we'll do it my way. Cautiously. Sterling isn't the kind of man to give up easily. He'll have eyes everywhere." They broke camp with a quiet efficiency. Juliana, despite his protests, insisted on helping, her movements still a bit stiff, but full of purpose. Soon they were riding double on his stallion, heading south. Ethan couldn't help but be aware of her presence behind him, her back pressed against his as they moved through the rugged Wyoming landscape. It was a strange intimacy, born from violence and desperation. "How did a man like you end up out here, anyway?" Juliana asked after a long stretch of silence, her voice closer to his ear than he expected. "You don't strike me as a typical cowboy," Ethan chuckled, a low, rough sound. "Is there such a thing? I came west after the war. Too many ghosts back in Missouri." He didn't elaborate, but he felt her shift slightly behind him. "The Union, I presume?" she asked quietly. "Yes, ma'am. Joined up in '63. I was 18. Saw more than any man ever should." The words came out before he could stop them. He rarely spoke of the war. Juliana was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My brother, Daniel, died at Gettysburg." The name of the place hung in the air between them, a shared scar. "I'm sorry," Ethan said softly, and he meant it. "I lost friends there too." "Is that why you live this solitary life?" she asked, her perception startling him again. "Because of what you saw?" He considered her question honestly. "Partly," he admitted, "but I also like the freedom. Out here, a man is judged by his actions, not by his family name or how much money he has." "And yet," Juliana observed, her voice thoughtful, "you're risking that freedom, risking everything, to help me fight a powerful man like Vernon Sterling." He didn't have a simple answer for that. He just knew he had to. "Some things are worth fighting for," he replied simply, and he felt her lean into him just a little, a silent gesture of understanding that said more than words ever could. But as they rode on, a new, unsettling thought began to form in Ethan's mind. Juliana said the town council arranged her cabin, but Sterling controlled the council. Why would he approve a cabin for a teacher he wanted dead? It didn't add up, unless the cabin itself was part of a trap. By mid-afternoon, they reached the outskirts of Jackson, a raw, burgeoning settlement nestled in the shadow of the towering Grand Tetons. Ethan reined in his horse on a high ridge overlooking the town. From here they could see the whole layout, a single dusty main street, a handful of wooden storefronts, a church steeple, and on the far eastern edge, a new-looking log building that had to be the schoolhouse. We'll wait here until dusk, he decided. Less chance of being spotted by anyone who might be looking for us. Juliana nodded, understanding the need for caution. They dismounted, sharing a simple meal of jerky and hard biscuits in the shade of a large pine. Ethan found himself studying her as she looked down at the town that was supposed to be her new home. Her face, which had been so pale and frightened by the river, was now filled with a quiet resolve. "Tell me about this school of yours," Ethan said, genuinely curious now. Her face lit up, the weariness vanishing from her eyes. "It's not much. Just a single room with some benches and a blackboard that came all the way from St. Louis. But it's a start. There are nearly 30 children in and around Jackson, Ethan. Some of them are teenagers who can't even write their own names. They deserve a chance." "And Sterling objects to that?" "He objects because an educated populace might start questioning his authority," she explained, her voice tinged with anger. "He likes things just the way they are. But there's more to it. The school was funded by his biggest rival, a man named James Hollister, who owns the sawmill. Apparently, anything Hollister supports, Sterling opposes on principle. It's a power struggle." Ethan frowned, the pieces clicking into place. "So you're caught in the middle of a feud between two rich men?" "Precisely," she said, a shudder passing through her. "Though I never imagined it would go this far. I thought I might face some opposition, perhaps some arguments at a town meeting. I never imagined he would hire men to try and kill me." "Men like Sterling think they're above the law," Ethan said grimly. "And out here, in a place like this, sometimes they are." The thought of the cabin Sterling's counsel had provided gnawed at him. It felt too easy, too convenient. As dusk settled over the valley, casting long purple shadows, they mounted up and rode toward Jackson. Ethan kept them to the back trails in the cover of the trees, avoiding the main road. The air grew cooler, and the town ahead began to glow with the warm yellow light of oil lamps in windows. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic. But Ethan knew better. Trouble was simmering just beneath the surface. The schoolhouse stood on the eastern edge of town, just as they'd seen from the ridge. Behind it, nestled in a small grove of aspen trees, was a small, simple log cabin. A thin curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney. "There it is," Juliana whispered, her voice a mix of excitement and nerves. But Ethan's eyes narrowed on the smoke. Someone was already there, or had recently been there. "Wait here," he instructed, his voice low. He swung down from the horse and drew his revolver, the familiar weight of it a grim comfort in his hand. He moved like a shadow, creeping forward, using the deepening darkness for cover. He circled the cabin first, checking the single window. It was dark inside. He moved to the front door, pressing his ear against the rough wood. Silence. The smoke must be from a dying fire. He crept back to Juliana. "It seems clear," he said, though his gut was still churning with suspicion. "But let's be quick about this." He helped her down from the horse, noticing the slight wince as her feet touched the ground. The ordeal in the river had taken a bigger toll than she was letting on. The cabin door was unlocked. Ethan pushed it open slowly, his gun raised, and stepped inside. It was sparse but clean. A small stove in the corner, a narrow bed, a simple table with 2 chairs, and a bookshelf that, to his surprise, was already filled with books. Juliana moved past him, her eyes wide as she took in the small space. She ran her hand over the rough-hewn table, then traced the spine of a book with her finger. "It's perfect," she breathed, turning to him with a smile that transformed her face. "My own school, my own home." Something in Ethan's chest tightened at her words. Home. It was a concept he'd abandoned years ago, a word that belonged to a different life. He was a drifter, a man who was always just passing through. He opened his mouth to tell her they couldn't stay, that the smoke was a bad sign, that this felt all wrong. But seeing the pure, unadulterated joy on her face, he just couldn't do it. Not yet. You should get some rest, he said instead, his voice gruff. I'll stable my horse. Tomorrow I'll go to the general store and get your things. The owner, a man named Abner Mills, should have held your trunks for you. He turned to leave, needing some air, needing to think. You can't leave, Juliana said suddenly, her voice sharp with alarm. She reached out and grabbed his arm. It's not safe for either of us. Sterling's men saw you rescue me. They know who you are now. She was right. He hesitated, torn between the propriety of the situation and the very real danger they both faced. If he left, she would be a sitting duck, and that wisp of smoke still bothered him. Someone had been here. I'll sleep by the stove, he conceded finally, just for tonight. That night, as Juliana slept soundly in her new bed for the first time, Ethan sat in one of the hard wooden chairs, his back to the wall, his rifle resting across his lap. He didn't build a fire in the stove. He didn't want to advertise their presence. He stared into the darkness, listening. He thought about the strange turn his life had taken in just 2 days. He was no longer just a cowboy. He was a bodyguard, a guardian, caught in a war he never intended to fight. He must have dozed off because a floorboard creaked somewhere outside, and he was on his feet in an instant, gun in hand, heart pounding in his chest. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. He saw a shadow detaching itself from the trees, moving toward the schoolhouse next door. It was a man carrying something, a can. Ethan didn't wait to see what was in it. He slipped out the cabin's back door as silently as he'd entered. He circled around, keeping to the deepest shadows. He saw the man splash a liquid from the can all along the base of the schoolhouse walls. The sharp, unmistakable smell of kerosene hit the air. The man was going to burn it down. He was going to burn down her dream before it even had a chance to begin. The man pulled a match from his pocket. Ethan heard the scratch as he struck it against the sole of his boot. In the brief flare of light, he saw the man's face. It was one of the two from the river. Before the man could touch the flame to the kerosene-soaked logs, Ethan was on him. He brought the barrel of his pistol down hard on the man's wrist. The match sputtered and died. The man grunted in pain, dropping the can and spinning around, pulling a knife. He was fast, but Ethan was faster. He didn't shoot. A gunshot would bring the whole town, and he wasn't ready for that. He sidestepped the wild slash of the knife and drove his fist into the man's gut. The air whooshed out of him. Ethan followed it with a hard right to the jaw. The man stumbled backward, his head hitting the log wall with a sickening thud. He slid to the ground, unconscious. Just then, the cabin door creaked open. "Ethan?" Juliana whispered, a lantern held high in her hand. The light spilled across the scene, illuminating the man on the ground, the spilled kerosene, the glint of steel from Ethan's revolver. Her eyes widened in horror. "Go back inside, Juliana," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Lock the door." But he knew it was too late. Sterling hadn't waited. He'd sent a message, and the message was clear. This was just the beginning. The fight for Juliana's school and for her life had already started. Morning brought a knock at the door. It was so loud and sudden that Ethan, who had been sitting awake all night, jolted to his feet, his gun drawn before he was even fully conscious of the movement. Juliana emerged from behind the simple curtain that separated her sleeping area, her face pale, her hair loose around her shoulders. She had seen the man he'd tied up in the small woodshed out back. She knew the danger wasn't just a possibility. It was breathing down their necks. "Who is it?" Ethan called out, his voice a low growl. He motioned for Juliana to stay back, away from the door. "Abner Mills, with Miss Harrington's trunks," a booming voice replied. "And if that's you in there, Ethan Quinn, and I suspect it is, you'd best have a damn good explanation for being in a lady's cabin at this hour." Ethan relaxed, but only slightly. He knew Abner. The shopkeeper was a decent man, but he was also the town's biggest gossip. He opened the door to find the portly, balding man standing beside a wagon, loaded down with Juliana's belongings. Abner's expression was a perfect mixture of curiosity and stern disapproval. "It's not what it looks like, Abner," Ethan began. "It rarely is," the older man replied dryly, his eyes scanning the cabin's interior. "But word's already spreading like wildfire. They're saying Sterling's men tried to drown the new schoolteacher, and some drifting cowboy fished her out of the Snake River. Seeing you here, well, it adds fuel to the fire." Juliana stepped forward, her posture regal despite wearing his borrowed clothes. "Mr. Mills, I presume. I'm Juliana Harrington. Mr. Quinn saved my life, and last night he stopped one of Mr. Sterling's men from burning down the schoolhouse." Abner's eyes widened, his folksy demeanor dropping away to reveal a sharp intelligence. He looked from Juliana to Ethan, and then at the locked woodshed. "He did what now?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Is the man—" "He's tied up in the shed," Ethan said grimly. "Alive. For now." Abner's expression softened as he looked at Juliana. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Harrington, despite the circumstances. Let's get your things inside, quickly. Then we need to talk. We need a plan, because Vernon Sterling has just declared war on you." With Abner's surprising strength, they quickly unloaded Juliana's 2 large trunks. Once inside, with the door bolted, the shopkeeper became a fountain of information. He laid out the town's ugly politics as they sat around Juliana's small table. "Sterling's got the sheriff, Jedediah, right in his pocket," Abner explained, his voice low. "Bought and paid for years ago. But Hollister, the sawmill owner, he's got friends too. This town's been a powder keg ever since the railroad survey came through last year. Both men want to control where the depot gets built. Control the depot, and you control the future of this whole valley." "What about the law?" Juliana asked, her voice laced with a frustration Ethan understood all too well. "Surely attempted murder, arson. These are serious crimes." "You'd need witnesses, miss," Abner interrupted gently. "And the man in your shed. Sterling's men will swear he was just a drunk who got lost. They'll claim you fell in the river by accident. It would be your word against theirs." "I'm a witness," Ethan said firmly, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "I saw them push her. I saw him with the kerosene." Abner shook his head sadly. "Ethan, you're a good man, but you're a drifter. Your word against the word of Sterling's foreman and his ranch hands. It wouldn't stick. The judge is a cousin of Sterling's wife. It's a rigged game." "So he just gets away with it?" Juliana's voice rose, her knuckles white as she gripped her coffee cup. "He gets away with trying to kill me." "Not necessarily," Abner replied, a thoughtful glint in his eye. "There are other kinds of justice out here. Sterling cares about 2 things in this world, his money and his reputation. He wants to be seen as the benevolent king of this valley. We have to hit him where it hurts." "The school," Ethan realized aloud. "If it succeeds, it's a public defeat for him." "Exactly," Abner nodded, slapping the table. "Open that school, Miss Harrington. You open that school, you teach these children, and you show this whole town that Vernon Sterling does not control everything and everyone. Public opinion is a powerful weapon, even more powerful than a paid-off sheriff." A fire ignited in Juliana's eyes, chasing away the fear. "The school is scheduled to open next Monday. That's just 5 days from now." "He'll try to stop you again," Ethan warned her, his gaze intense. "Last night was just a taste. He'll get bolder." "Then we'll need to be ready," Juliana replied, her gaze meeting his with an unwavering resolve that sent a jolt through him. "Will you help me, Ethan? I can't do this alone." The question hung in the air between them. It was more than a request for help. It was an invitation into her fight, into her life. He had responsibilities. He had cattle to deliver. He had a job waiting for him at a ranch near Cheyenne. Staying in Jackson meant throwing all of that away. It meant risking his life for a woman he'd met less than 3 days ago, for a cause that was not his own. But looking at her, at the fierce, unbreakable spirit in those blue eyes, he knew he didn't have a choice. He was already in this. He had been from the moment he'd spurred his horse down that ridge. "I'll help you," he said, the certainty in his voice surprising even himself. The next 5 days were a blur, a frantic race against time. Ethan dealt with the man in the woodshed. He rode him 10 miles out of town, left him with a stern warning, and sent him walking. Killing him would have made Ethan a murderer. Letting him go was a risk, but it was the only play he had. Then he delivered his cattle to the nearby ranch, collected his pay, and told the foreman he was quitting. He rode back into Jackson and took a room at the boarding house, close enough to Juliana's cabin to keep an eye on things, but far enough away to quiet the wagging tongues Abner had warned him about. Together with Abner and a few other brave townsfolk who secretly hated Sterling, they prepared for war, or rather for a school opening. Juliana was a whirlwind of motion. She threw herself into organizing the schoolhouse, arranging the rough-hewn benches, cleaning the blackboard, and preparing her first week of lessons. She walked through the town, knocking on doors, her head held high, meeting the parents of her prospective students. Word of her near drowning and the attempted arson had spread. Some folks were terrified, pulling their children's names off her list. But for every family that backed out, another, more defiant one, signed up. Her courage was contagious. She was becoming a symbol of resistance against Sterling's iron-fisted rule. Ethan found himself watching her, mesmerized. He'd known brave men in the war, men who would charge into a hail of bullets. But Juliana's courage was different. It was quieter, more steadfast. It was the courage to stand up, day after day, against a threat that was always lurking just out of sight. He found himself falling for her, a little more each day. It was a terrifying feeling. On the Sunday evening before the school was set to open, Ethan walked Juliana back to her cabin after they'd shared a meal at the boarding house. The setting sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the dusty street. They walked in a comfortable silence, both of them lost in thought about the day to come. 22 students, Juliana said finally, her voice filled with a hopeful excitement. 22 have confirmed they will be there tomorrow. That's more than I ever dared hope for. People recognize a good thing when they see it, Ethan replied, watching the golden light catch the highlights in her dark hair. You've won them over. She smiled up at him, a real, genuine smile. We've won them over. I couldn't have done any of this without you, Ethan. They reached the door of her cabin, and a sudden, awkward silence fell between them. The air was charged with everything they hadn't said over the past 5 days. The connection between them was a palpable thing, a current running just beneath the surface. Juliana, Ethan began, then hesitated. He was a man of action, not words. He felt clumsy, uncertain. I want you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, I'm proud to be standing with you." She looked up at him, her blue eyes searching his face in the twilight. "Is that all you wanted to say?" she asked softly. Ethan swallowed hard. His heart was hammering against his ribs. "No," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But the rest of it might be improper, considering we've only known each other less than a week." A slow, teasing smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I nearly died in that river, Ethan. It has a way of clarifying what matters and what doesn't. Propriety seems a lot less important to me now." Before he could process her words, before he could think of what to say next, she rose on her tiptoes, leaned in, and pressed a gentle, lingering kiss to his cheek. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a shock wave through him. "Good night, Ethan Quinn," she whispered. "I'll see you in the morning." He stood there, completely speechless, as she slipped inside the cabin and closed the door. His hand rose to touch the spot on his cheek where her lips had been. A slow smile spread across his face. He felt like a young boy again. Tomorrow, Vernon Sterling could bring the devil himself to their doorstep. It didn't matter. Tonight, for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Quinn felt like he had something to fight for, and he would be damned if he was going to lose. The morning of the school's opening dawned clear and bright, the Wyoming sky a vast, unforgiving blue. Ethan was on the schoolhouse porch before the sun had even fully crested the Tetons. He didn't want to hide in the shadows. He wanted to be seen. He'd cleaned and oiled his revolver the night before, and it sat heavy and reassuring on his hip. He wanted any of Sterling's men who might be watching to see him there, a silent guardian at the gate. He was a message. Shortly after 8 o'clock, they started to arrive. Parents, their faces a mixture of hope and fear, walking their children toward the small log building. They eyed Ethan curiously, some with suspicion, but most seemed to take comfort in his steady, watchful presence. A man with a gun on the porch meant the school was protected. By 9, the schoolroom was buzzing with the nervous energy of children. There were 22 of them, just as Juliana had said, ranging in age from a 6-year-old girl with bright red pigtails to a 16-year-old boy who was already taller than Ethan. They sat on the rough wooden benches, their eyes wide as they looked at the woman standing before the blackboard. Ethan remained outside, his senses on high alert, scanning the street, the distant hills, everywhere. But he couldn't resist glancing through the window from time to time. He watched Juliana teach, and it was like watching a different person. She was transformed, radiant with a purpose that seemed to flow out of her. She was gentle but firm, and the children, who had been shy and uncertain at first, quickly warmed to her. She was a natural. She was building something real, something that would last. It was almost noon when he saw them. 3 riders approaching slowly, deliberately. They kicked up a cloud of dust that seemed to follow them like a shroud. The man in the lead was tall and impeccably dressed, with silver-streaked hair that glinted in the sun. Vernon Sterling himself. Flanked on either side of him were the same 2 thugs Ethan had seen at the river, the one whose wrist he'd nearly broken, and the one he'd knocked unconscious behind the schoolhouse. They both stared at him with pure, undisguised hatred. Ethan didn't move. He just straightened up, letting his hand rest casually on the grip of his Colt. The 3 riders reined in their horses right in front of the schoolhouse, blocking the path. The happy sounds of children learning from inside seemed to die away, replaced by a tense, heavy silence. "You must be the cowboy," Sterling said. His voice was smooth, cultured, like whiskey over ice. It was the voice of a man used to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. "I understand you've taken quite an interest in our new schoolteacher." "Mr. Sterling," Ethan acknowledged with a slow, deliberate nod. He didn't rise to the bait. He would let Sterling make the first move. "What brings you to this fine institution, considering an education for yourself?" A muscle twitched in Sterling's jaw, the only sign that the insult had landed. He maintained his cold composure. "I've come to speak with Miss Harrington," he said, swinging down from his horse with a fluid grace that belied his age. "It's a simple matter of property rights. This land, you see, belongs to me." "That's interesting," Ethan replied, his voice mild, "because the deed filed down at the county office says it belongs to the town of Jackson, deeded specifically for the purpose of a school. He'd checked it himself 2 days ago. Paperwork can be mistaken," Sterling said smoothly. His men remained on their horses, their hands hovering near their own weapons. They were watching Ethan, waiting for a signal from their boss. "I simply want to discuss the situation with the lady. Civilly, of course." "Civilly?" Ethan asked, and now his voice hardened, losing its mild tone. Like you were at the river. That didn't seem very civil to me. Sterling's mask of politeness didn't slip, but his eyes, cold and gray as a winter sky, flickered briefly to his men. I have no idea what you're referring to, he said. Perhaps the lady had an unfortunate accident. An accident where two men, your men, Ethan said, taking a small step forward, dragged her to the water and threw her in. That's called attempted murder where I come from. He was blocking Sterling's path to the schoolhouse door now. He could smell the expensive cologne coming off the man, a scent of civilization that couldn't hide the rot underneath. Just then, the schoolhouse door opened. Juliana stepped out. She stood straight and tall, her posture radiating a dignity that seemed to make her taller. Ethan could see the fear in her eyes, but no one else would have. She had locked it away. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice cool and clear as a bell. "You're interrupting our lessons." Sterling turned, and the practiced, charming smile was back on his face, replacing the scowl. "Ah, Miss Harrington, I am so pleased to see you've recovered from your mishap. I've come to discuss the future of this establishment." "The future is happening right now inside that building," Juliana replied, gesturing toward the windows where the curious faces of children were now peering out. 22 students who deserve an education, an opportunity you seem determined to deny them. Education is a valuable thing, certainly, Sterling conceded with a patronizing nod. But perhaps not in this location. As I was explaining to your hired gun here, this land is part of my ranch. I'm prepared to offer you a generous sum to relocate your little school. Somewhere, further away. This land doesn't belong to you, Mr. Sterling, Juliana stated firmly, her voice ringing with conviction. And neither does this town. The days of you controlling everyone and everything in Jackson are over. A crowd had begun to gather. Parents who had been lingering nearby, shopkeepers drawn out by the confrontation, curious townspeople. Ethan saw Abner Mills standing near the front, his arms crossed over his chest. He also saw James Hollister, the sawmill owner, pushing his way through the crowd. Sterling saw him too. He saw his audience growing, and he seemed to recalculate his approach. "I am simply concerned about the well-being of our community," Sterling announced, his voice now projecting to the crowd. "A school requires proper oversight, a proper board of directors." "Which it has," a new voice interrupted. James Hollister stepped forward, a big, bluff man with a booming voice. He came to stand beside Juliana, a clear and public declaration of his support. "The town council approved this school 3 months ago, Vernon. Your objections were noted, and they were overruled. This is settled business." Sterling's face darkened with fury. He was losing control of the narrative. "This isn't over, Hollister," he snarled. "Actually, I believe it is," Ethan interjected. He stepped closer to Sterling, so close he could see the man's pulse beating in his neck. He lowered his voice so only Sterling could hear him. "Unless you want me to start telling every single person in this crowd exactly what I saw your men do to Miss Harrington at the river. I may be just a drifting cowboy, but I've got a feeling folks around here might start to wonder why a respected, community-minded businessman like yourself would need to drown a schoolteacher." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Ethan could feel the murderous rage radiating off of Sterling. He thought the man might just give the signal, consequences be damned. But Sterling was too shrewd for that. A public gunfight was messy. It was bad for business. With a cold, reptilian smile, he stepped back. "You've made a powerful enemy today, cowboy," he murmured, his voice a venomous whisper. "And you, Miss Harrington, would be wise to watch your back. Is that another threat, Sterling?" Hollister boomed, making sure the entire crowd could hear. "Because I think we all heard that one loud and clear." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People were looking at Sterling differently now, not with fear, but with contempt. He glanced around, suddenly realizing the tide of public opinion had turned against him. He was no longer the king on his throne. He was just a bully. With a curt nod to his men, he remounted his horse. "Enjoy your little victory," he spat, his eyes locking with Ethan's one last time. Then he spurred his horse and galloped down the street, his two thugs following close behind like dogs at his heel. A ragged cheer went up from the onlookers. Ethan finally allowed himself to breathe. He turned to Juliana. She was already looking at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and something much deeper, something that made his heart race. "I believe," she said, turning to the crowd, her voice steady and strong, "that we have lessons to continue." The parents ushered their children back inside, many of them stopping to offer Juliana a handshake or a word of support as they passed. Hollister shook Ethan's hand firmly. "You've got more sand than any 10 men in this town, Quinn," he said. "If you ever need anything, you let me know." Then he too was gone, leaving Ethan alone on the porch as the sounds of learning resumed inside the schoolhouse. For the rest of the afternoon, Ethan kept his vigil. He didn't think Sterling would be foolish enough to return so soon, but he wasn't taking any chances. When the last student had finally gone home for the day, he stepped inside the schoolhouse. He found Juliana at the blackboard, erasing the day's lessons, a small, peaceful smile on her face. "You did it," he said simply. She turned, setting the eraser down on the chalk rail. "We did it," she corrected him. "But this isn't over. A man like Sterling won't give up so easily." "No," Ethan agreed, walking toward her. "But he'll have to be more careful now. Public opinion is a hard thing to fight. It won't be as easy for him to act against you openly." Juliana crossed the small space between them, her steps slow and deliberate. She stopped just in front of him, so close he could see the faint dusting of chalk on her cheek. "What happens now, Ethan?" she asked, her voice soft. "You delivered your cattle. Your job here is done. There's nothing keeping you in Jackson." The question hung in the air, loaded with a world of unspoken meaning. It was the same question he'd been asking himself all day. His old life, the life of a drifter, was calling to him. It was easy. It was safe. But it was also empty. "There might be something keeping me here," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Someone, rather." Her breath hitched. "We've known each other for barely a week." "Sometimes a week is all it takes to know what matters," Ethan replied, echoing her own words from the night before. "I wasn't looking for this, Juliana. I was just passing through, doing a job. But then I saw you in that river and something changed. Everything changed." "Because you had to rescue me?" she asked, a hint of a challenge in her voice. She needed to know it was more than just a sense of duty. "No," Ethan said, and he reached out, taking her hands in his. They were small and warm, and they fit perfectly in his. "Because watching you fight for your life in that water, watching you fight for this school, for these children, it made me want to fight for something again. It made me want to build something instead of just drifting through." Juliana's fingers tightened around his. "Are you saying you want to stay in Jackson?" "I'm saying I want to stay wherever you are," Ethan admitted, the words feeling more right than anything he'd ever said. "If you'll have me." "That sounds dangerously close to a proposal, Mr. Quinn," Juliana said, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears of happiness. Ethan smiled, a real unguarded smile that reached his eyes. For the first time, he felt a certainty that settled deep in his soul. "Not yet," he said, "but maybe someday soon, if you're amenable." Instead of answering with words, Juliana rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. It wasn't a tentative kiss like the one on her doorstep. This was a kiss of promise, of passion, of a future he hadn't known he wanted until she'd been thrown into his life. His arms wrapped around her waist, drawing her closer, and something that had been long dormant and frozen inside of him finally burst into bloom. When they finally parted, both of them breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I'll take that as a yes to my not quite a proposal," he murmured. Juliana laughed, a sound of pure joy that filled the quiet schoolhouse. "Yes, Ethan Quinn," she said. "Yes to staying. Yes to whatever comes next." There in the simple log schoolhouse that had brought them together, with the golden afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, Ethan knew he had found it. The thing he hadn't even known he was searching for all those lonely years. It wasn't just love. It was purpose. It wasn't just a woman. It was a partner. He had jumped into those churning rapids expecting only to save a life. He had never imagined that in doing so, he would end up saving his own. If you enjoyed this story, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next.